Japan, the country we associate today with advanced robots, fast-flying trains, and beautiful landscapes, once was completely different from the futurist metropolis we see today. Only a century or two ago, Japan was still in the so-called seclusion era, in which it shorted its borders and refused to make contact with any outsiders, in hopes of keeping their land pure from all evils. But after being strangled into opening up, Japan would pull a dramatic 180 and turn from a small archipelago to international superpower in staggering fashion. This documentary aims to shed light on Japan's immeasurable growth during the late 19th and early 20th century. Our journey starts back in 1854 when a man by the name of Matthew C. Perry found himself in Japan. Representing the United States, his mission was to open up Japan at all costs. After seemingly retreating once and for all, Perry came back with an even larger fleet, and it soon became clear that Japan was in no shape or form to be able to defend itself against such a powerful nation. Eventually, with the introduction of the Treaty of Kanagawa the same year, chaos began ensuing within Japanese leadership. Centuries prior to this encounter, it was the shogun's task to defend the emperor at all costs, but in this situation, they failed him greatly. This resulted in division amongst Japanese leadership, which led to the Boshin War. On one side was the Tokugawa shogunate, a conglomerate of a large group of shoguns who was facing against a comparatively weaker force in Emperor Meiji, being only 15 years old at the time of the incident. In the end, whilst the emperor's forces were originally outnumbered, they employed modern tactics to outsmart their enemies and eventually forced the Tokugawa to surrender. With the entire country of Japan unified under his cause, Emperor Meiji, as well as his successors in Taisha and Showa, will go on to lead Japan through its metamorphosis phase in the coming decades. First off, Emperor Meiji immediately began to reform the entire structure of the government. At its inauguration ceremony, he issued the Charter Oath, a list of a number of issues he and his administration will aim to resolve in due time. The document, now known today as Japan's first ever constitution, will go on to inspire additional and more so-called radical changes that will impact Japan forever. Additionally, Japan began sending out diplomats to highly successful countries around the world, taking bits and pieces of the best parts of each different type of government. For example, the judicial system, as well as Japan's main constitution, were taken from Prussia, while also incorporating parts of Confucianism and German conversatism into the mix. Additionally, Catholicism was reintroduced into the country, allowing many civilians to freely express their beliefs without fear of repercussions. In terms of government and politics, great reforms occurred here as well, with Japan switching from an absolute monarchy to a parliamentary constitutional monarchy. This was a big shift in political thinking, but the Japanese were able to adapt and use the system to their advantage. Additionally, the Meiji Era is also well known for the economic turnaround it spearheaded. The Meiji administration used a mix between private and publicly held companies, as well as heavily subsidizing many industries to elevate them to new heights. Two companies in particular, Mitsubishi and Mitsubishi, led the charge, with Japan transitioning from an agriculture-based economy to one based around manufacturing and mining in a rapid fashion. The Meiji Era also saw a radical shift in terms of geopolitics and interactions with other nations. Throughout the Restoration period, Japan was engaged in a variety of conflicts, starting off with the Sino-Japanese War. This was fought between the Hoshino dynasty as well as the Qing dynasty of China. China requested additional Korean assistance but was originally declined, and what resulted could only be described as a total collapse on China's behalf when the Japanese crushed her ill-prepared forces. After the conflict, Japan was forced to give back its territorial gains when Russia and Germany pressured them out. Next, Japan, not being content with the results of the Sino-Japanese War, once again set its focus on China. Japan, along with a coalition of Britain, Russia, and Germany, squashed a rebellion in China that resulted in no tangible gains for Japan, except for an increased global presence and a better internal conflict record. Finally, last but not least, was the Russo-Japanese War, which was fought over areas of Manchuria as well as parts of Korea. It resulted in a decisive victory for the Japanese. Being the heavy underdogs, Russia did not anticipate the quickness and ferociousness that the Japanese used. After the disastrous battles of Port Arthur, the Yeltsin, and Tsushima, Russia was forced to surrender. It's interesting to see how Japan turned from a prey to predator against Russia, once again showcasing their ever-evolving impact against others in their nearby region. At the end of the Meiji Era, Japan had undergone a radical transformation in all areas of life, from the economy to the government, and even began treading the waters of international ordeals. Next up in the ascension to the throne was Emperor Taisha, who was immediately tasked with handling the global crisis that we know today as World War I. He reigned from 1912 to 1926 and used the cover of World War I to expand their Pacific Empire. Japan sided with the Allied forces and together with Great Britain were able to retake valuable assets scattered throughout the region. Under Taisha, the government was also slightly revised to include a military junta, or a joint agreement of power shared between both the parliament and military leaders. Taisha was also presented with the irresistible opportunity to seize additional territories north in Russia during the chaos associated with the collapse of the Russian Empire. At the time, Japan decided to aid the US cause in the conflict, but also had different underlying reasons to be a part of the conflict, such as the ability to retain previous territorial losses and prevent the spread of communism further south to the mainland. After the majority of the fighting was complete, Japan still chose to station a sizable force around 6,000 strong in Russia, but was forced to pull out when the US and Britain pressured them out. Finally, we move on to Emperor Showa, who reigned from 1926 to his death in 1989. His administration, as well as parliament, had a variety of issues to clean up, including the public's worsening tensions with democracy, as well as a tightened economic outlook. Japan began transitioning towards totalitarianism, or more specifically, Showa statism. It was a mixture of nationalism, militarism, fascism, and even some capitalism, and essentially turned Japan from a more democratically based parliament to a military dictatorship. Numerous coups were attempted to restore the government back to its original form, with one notable one being the February 26th incident, involving a squadron of soldiers protesting or demonstrating outside the police headquarters. Additionally, while chaos was occurring in the government, issues arose with the introduction of the global Great Depression. Japan was decently well set up to handle the Great Depression initially, so they had significant stockpiles and secure resources in its overseas colonies, but would go on to import a few materials from the United States. This highlighted a particular issue for Japan, one that the military and political leaders alike were keen on eliminating in the coming years. Furthermore, in 1938, not satisfied with laying low, they continued their military endeavor into the Soviet Union this time, though quickly put pen to paper after a few disastrous losses. On top of that, Japan would participate in a second Sino-Japanese War, with Japan essentially going against both Mao's communists and Chiang's nationalists, as they both had an unofficial treaty to get rid of Japan, before settling their internal hatred later. More importantly, the relationship between Japan and the United States had deteriorated severely, with Japan's membership in a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy considered the turning point. To culminate with Japan's infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, and what followed included the likes of the Battle of Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, and the Battle of Iwo Jima, and ended with the infamous atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, in conclusion, the impact of the Japanese Empire had during its 79-year reign is undeniably astounding yet unsurprising to many, including myself. During Japan's rapid industrialization and militarization, many Western nations were too focused on their domestic problems to recognize the uprising threat thousands of miles away. Japan terrorized millions within its sphere of influence, yet at the same time was still a young nation reborn in a matter of decades. Yet, another 77 years later, Japan has once again revitalized itself, becoming the world's third largest economy in staggering fashion and shocking the world in the process. And if just one thing to take out of this documentary, is that the resilience and willingness to improve oneself is what propelled and will continue to drive forward Japan's bright future.